A velvet cushion was pricked with pins, but one of them held a deadly secret. Welcome to Enigma Obieto. I am your host, Carlos. I'm always curious where in the world are you joining us from today? Every comment adds warmth to this mystery-loving circle. Let's begin. A single name on the church donation list crossed out in ink leads to secrets buried beneath stained glass. Welcome to Enigma Obieto. I am your host, Antonio. Tell me, where are you tuning in from this evening? Reading your comments is the best part of my day. Let's begin. The summer sun glowed with a soft, syrupy warmth over the village of Nether Durnham, a place where gossip grew as reliably as the hollyhocks, and the church clock chimed with dependable punctuality. On this particular Saturday, bunting fluttered cheerily across the village green, trestle tables groaned under the weight of Victoria sponges and lemon-curd tarts, and the air buzzed with the mingled sounds of brass band rehearsals, bees, and local chatter. It was the day of the annual garden fete, held on the rectory grounds, always the social event of the season, especially since Lady Beckwith had taken over the planning committee. "Such a lovely turnout," murmured Miss Marple, her gloved hands folded neatly over her handbag as she surveyed the proceedings from beneath the shade of a white parasol, her faded blue eyes deceptively mild. Observed everything and everyone, the hasty smiles between neighbours, the polite refusals at the jam stall, the tense politeness exchanged between Mrs. Dalrymple and her estranged niece by the croquet lawn. Not far off, the rector's wife was embroiled in a fuss over a missing silver cake knife, and Lady Beckwith herself stood by the raffle tent, resplendent in lavender and pearls. Booming instructions at her overworked niece, Charlotte, there was a pie baking contest, a second-hand book table, and a guess at the number of buttons in the jar game currently being dominated by the children from the local school. It was all perfectly pleasant, perfectly typical, until, of course, it wasn't, at precisely 3 o'clock. Just as the coconut shy reopened and a flock of church ladies swooped down upon the strawberry scones, a shrill scream cracked the air. A few startled birds lifted from the yew hedges, the crowd turned, murmurs rose. It came from the sewing tent, one of the newer additions to the fete, thanks to Mrs. Tilling. A newcomer with a fondness for crewel work and vintage embroidery. People moved like a current toward the open canvas flap. Miss Marple followed at a thoughtful pace, her cane tapping quietly over the grass. Inside, chaos brewed. Charlotte Beckwith stood stock-still, her hand clamped over her mouth, eyes wide in horror. Mrs. Tilling, face ashen, was kneeling beside a figure collapsed across a chair. Head slumped forward over a velvet cushion embroidered with a delicate rose pattern. Several spools of thread had rolled across the rug, and a teacup lay shattered at the woman's feet. It was Mrs. Dorothea Langford Wealthy, sharp-tongued, and to many utterly intolerable. She had been seen not 10 minutes earlier, criticizing the lace hem of the WI banner. Now she was deathly still. The doctor, summoned hastily from the lemonade stand, bent over her with furrowed brow. His verdict was swift and grim: she's dead, and not from natural causes. Gasps rippled like wind across the grass. Someone dropped a plate. Miss Marple blinked, then quietly knelt to pick up a fallen thimble near the edge of the velvet cushion. Her voice, when it came, was soft, almost conversational. "I dare say that's not the usual use for a sewing cushion." And with that gentle observation, the atmosphere of the fete transformed from idyllic to something altogether darker. The village, as always, would talk, but Miss Marple would listen. By the time the village clock struck 3:30, the fete had dissolved into disorder. Half-eaten scones lay abandoned on paper doilies, raffle tickets fluttered in the breeze, and children were hurried away by anxious mothers who muttered about shocking scenes and too much excitement for one afternoon. The brass band had fallen into silence. the notes from its last waltz still hovering awkwardly in the air. What had been a cheerful gathering had become the setting of something altogether sinister. The vicar, Reverend Silas Hakam, stood pale and uncertain near the entrance to the sewing tent, clutching his straw hat to his chest, as though it might shield him from the implications of the tragedy unfolding just yards from the jam stall. Miss Marple remained on the green, quietly watching as a pair of constables from the nearby market town of Ashcombe arrived in a hastily summoned motorcar. They were led to the scene by Lady Beckwith, whose usual commanding tone had been replaced. With strained civility, I assure you, she told them, it was quite dreadful. The poor woman simply collapsed. Constable Brewer, young and well-meaning, but plainly out of his depth, nodded and jotted in a small notebook as his superior, Inspector Grayson, stepped into the tent. The inspector, a middle-aged man with a moustache that gave him the air of a weary walrus, surveyed the scene with tight-lipped solemnity. Clear the area, he instructed. Nobody in or out unless I say so. Within moments, a perimeter of hay bales and bunting was commandeered to create a makeshift cordon. Villagers hovered just beyond it. A semicircle of curious faces peering in and whispering with growing fervour, "Dead, is she, at the sewing tent? I always said those needles were dangerous. Well, she wasn't exactly popular, was she? The way she carried on about the bell ringers last month. Didn't she have some sort of row with that new woman Mrs. Tilling? Didn't she? Only a week ago, over that tapestry class. And so it began. In Nether Durnham, murder was an unexpected guest. But gossip was a lifelong tenant, Miss Marple, having retreated to a nearby bench beneath a sycamore tree, sat with quiet composure. She accepted a paper cup of lemonade from young Jenny Carter, one of her Sunday school pupils from years past, and watched as people gradually drifted into their own little huddles. Conversations turned inward, heads bowed close, theories whispered. With relish, Charlotte Beckwith, still visibly shaken, was being attended to by Mrs. Finch, the wife of the local pharmacist, Mrs. Finch. A woman with a fondness for lavender sachets and unsolicited advice, had taken it upon herself to fan the girl's flushed face while repeatedly muttering about feminine nerves. She just sat there, stiff, and her eyes were open. Charlotte stammered. I thought she was asleep at first, just slumped forward. And you didn't see anyone else near the table? Asked Constable Brewer, glancing over his notes. No, she whispered. Just me and Mrs. Tilling. And that sewing cushion, Miss Marple tilted her head slightly, as though that final phrase had caught the wind like a sail. Did someone say sewing cushion? Asked Mrs. Lockhart, the butcher's wife. Arrives breathless with a tartan shawl and an appetite for news. Was it poisoned? Then I read a thing once about poison stitched into lace. Don't be daft, replied Mr. Prothero, who ran the bicycle repair shop. It's more likely she choked on a pin. One of them was embroidery accidents. No sign of choking, piped up Mr. Finch, who had drifted over from the pharmacy with the practiced air of a man eager to be consulted. No visible wound either, or so young. Dr. Llewellyn says, but they're calling it suspicious, aren't they? I heard someone mention digitalis. Miss Marple listened politely, her hands folded in her lap. She said nothing, but her eyes flitted over each speaker with interest. Gossip, after all, was not just idle chatter in her view. It was a map of social tension, a chart of unspoken truths and long-held grudges. Later that evening, as the sun dipped low and cast golden light across the cottages of the High Street, Miss Marple made her way slowly home. The lane to her cottage was still lined with remnants of bunting. She paused outside her front gate, where her geraniums bloomed defiantly in the heat. She had not said much that afternoon, nor had she drawn any conclusions, but a few things sat unsettled in her mind. Mrs. Langford, though widely disliked, was never seen as vulnerable. She was formidable in both voice and opinion, often loud about others' failings and silent about her own, and yet today she had died quietly, at a fete of all places among embroidered cushions and lemon drizzle cakes. Miss Marple recalled, quite distinctly, that only yesterday she had seen Mrs. Langford engaged in what could only be described as a minor skirmish with Mrs. Tilling outside the village shop. The topic, something to do with borrowed sewing supplies. An accusation, a denial, and a stare so cold it could curdle cream. And now, the woman was dead, Miss Marple opened the gate and stepped into her garden. Where a watering can waited by the hydrangeas, she moved slowly but with purpose, as if her very steps were sorting something out inside her mind. Later, as she prepared her supper, a simple boiled egg and toast, she paused by the wireless and listened as the evening news droned on about political matters and overseas treaties. Nothing, of course, about Nether Durnham, that sort of thing. Never made the papers until a second body turned up. She sat at her table, buttered her toast carefully, and reached for the crossword. But even as she filled in the blank squares, her thoughts wandered not to synonyms and cryptic clues, but to a certain velvet cushion and the look of Charlotte Beckwith's pale face. Miss Marple, as always, had begun noticing the details that others missed. She did not yet know what the death of Dorothea Langford meant, but she had a strong suspicion that this was not the kind of crime resolved by fingerprint powder and boot prints. It was a matter, as it so often was, of character, and character, in her experience, always left a trail if one knew how to follow it. By Sunday morning, Nether Durnham had become a village divided half in mourning and half in morbid excitement. Church bells rang a little more solemnly that day, though the hymns proceeded with customary devotion. Reverend Hakim gave a gentle, if cautious, sermon on the impermanence of life and the unexpected nature of fate, with only the most oblique reference to the tragic incident at yesterday's gathering. Still, his eyes flickered repeatedly toward the third pew on the left, where Miss Marple sat in her usual place beside Mrs. Price Jeffreys, hymn book held open, but her thoughts clearly elsewhere. The congregation was restless. Whispers drifted through the nave like wood smoke. After the service, the green once again filled with hushed voices and darting glances. She just keeled over, right there in the chair. Poor woman, though I wouldn't say she was universally adored. That Mrs. Langford had more enemies than a wasp's nest. Well, I heard she changed her will only last week. Perhaps someone didn't like what they were or weren't getting. Miss Marple lingered at the edge of the crowd, sipping tepid tea from a paper cup, her ears attuned to the currents of village speculation. Unlike many of her neighbours, she knew better than to leap to conclusions. The truth had a way of hiding behind the obvious, and in her experience, the more confident the assumptions of others, the more likely they were wrong. She had not yet visited the scene again. The sewing tent remained cordoned off, a pitiful sight now, with its flaps drawn and bunting sagging, like a flag at half-mast, but she had begun to make her own inquiries discreet. Of course, she started with Mrs. Tilling. The newcomer lived in a modest but charming cottage at the edge of the village, with hollyhocks pressed up against the windows, and a rosebush so violently pink it looked almost indecent in the morning light. Miss Marple arrived under the very natural pretext of returning a borrowed embroidery pattern, one she had in fact never taken. Mrs. Tilling answered the door still in her housecoat, her eyes rimmed with fatigue. "Oh, Miss Marple, I wasn't expecting anyone to come in. Everything's such a muddle. I hardly slept a wink." "I'm not surprised," Miss Marple said gently, stepping over a basket of tangled threads. "I dare say it was quite a dreadful shock." Mrs. Tilling led her to the sitting room, where a pot of tea stood cooling on a crocheted mat. "I keep going over it," she said. "We'd only just finished setting up the displays Charlotte and I and Mrs. Langford came in, sat herself right down and began criticizing the workmanship on the velvet cushion, said the cross-stitch was wobbly. That was the word she used, wobbly. She gave a brittle laugh. Then she took one of the cherry scones, said it was dry, and asked for a better chair. Charlotte fetched her one. I went to the back to fetch a needle roll I'd left behind honestly. I was only gone a minute. When I came back, she looked like she'd nodded off. Only, well, you know what happened next. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully. And you say she was quite herself when she arrived? Oh yes, Mrs. Tilling said. Brusque as ever, but perfectly alert, no mention of feeling unwell, none at all. Though, if you ask me, she hadn't looked entirely right for days. Her colours were off, yellowish, almost. Miss Marple made a small sound in her throat, a kind of neutral hum, and let the silence stretch just long enough to feel unforced. Mrs. Tilling. She said at last, I hesitate to mention it, but I happened to overhear that you and Mrs. Langford had a difference of opinion at the greengrocer's not long ago. The younger woman flushed. Oh, I'm sure it looked worse than it was, she said quickly. She accused me of borrowing her sewing scissors and not returning them. I hadn't. Of course, I have my own gold-handled, inherited from my aunt, but once she got something in her head. Miss Marple nodded, her expression one of perfect understanding. I know how difficult Mrs. Langford could be, but people don't usually die over embroidery disputes. No, said Mrs. Tilling, her voice quiet now, but I suppose some resentments go deeper than thread. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple paid a call to young Dr. Llewellyn, ostensibly to inquire after his mother's lumbago, but in truth to gather more precise information. She found him in his modest surgery, thumbing through a reference book and looking rather pale himself. On Miss Marple, he said, rising awkwardly, come about Mrs. Llewellyn. She's still quite stiff in the lower back. Yes, but otherwise no complaints. Miss Marple accepted his diagnosis with a small smile before shifting the topic. I don't mean to press you, doctor, but I was wondering if there's been any formal finding on Mars, Langford's passing. He sighed and set the book aside. Nothing definite. Yet no visible wounds. Her heart seemed strong. It's odd, I'll admit. I've sent for a toxicology panel, of course, though it may take some time. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled behind her glasses, and poison would explain the lack of struggle. Yes, he said, rubbing his temple, if it were a fast-acting alkaloid something. Like aconitine or scopolamine, symptoms could mimic a fainting spell before death set in. Rather theatrical, Miss Marple mused, if one wanted to create an impression of serenity. Dr. Llewellyn gave her a curious glance. You think it was deliberate? Then, oh, I think nothing at all yet. She replied mildly, but I have always believed that murder, when it happens, is rarely without rehearsal. That evening, back in her parlour, Miss Marple sat with her knitting by the hearth. The flames flickered low in the grate despite the summer warmth, more for company than heat. She had completed 3 rows of a soft grey scarf when her mind drifted back to something Charlotte Beckwith had said the day before. She just sat there, stiff, and then that cushion, velvet, decorative, but suspiciously central to the scene, not moved, not fallen. Miss Marple closed her eyes briefly. Velvet, she knew, could be ideal for hiding something thin, sharp, or laced, and unlike most chairs at the fete, that particular seat had been chosen, not offered, not assigned. She resumed her knitting, her fingers steady. No, it wasn't the embroidery that concerned her, it was the intent behind the arrangement, and in a village like Nether Durnham, appearances always came first, especially when there was something to hide. By Monday morning, the mood in Nether Durnham had turned from curiosity to cautious suspicion. The bunting had been taken down, the fete tables cleared away, and the rectory lawn returned to its usual trimmed quietness. Yet the air still carried an echo of something unsettled, like a string left slightly out of tune. Inspector Grayson had returned to the village with a small team from the county. He was no longer playing the gentleman detective as he had the first day, but had shifted into something sterner, more methodical. Door-to-door inquiries were underway, and villagers were starting to feel the weight of glances that lingered just a moment too long. Miss Marple, for her part, did not rush. She had learned over many years that truth often unravelled at its own pace. It wasn't haste that solved a crime, but the careful stitching together of character, motive, and the small things that didn't quite fit that morning. As she passed Beckwith Manor on her way to the post office, she noticed Charlotte standing by the wrought iron gate, her shoulders slightly hunched. A basket of laundry rested on her hip, but she wasn't moving, just staring at the hedgerow across the lane as if it might give her an answer she hadn't thought to ask. Miss Marple paused, adjusted the brim of her straw hat, and called out gently, "Such a fine morning, dear, though it looks as though your thoughts are caught in a storm." Charlotte turned, startled, and gave a wan smile. Her fair hair had been hastily tied back, and dark circles nestled beneath her eyes. "Oh, Miss Marple, I didn't see you there. I was just thinking. That's often where trouble begins," Miss Marple said, walking closer. "Might I keep you company for a moment?" Charlotte hesitated, then opened the gate. "Of course, come round to the back garden. I've just put on a pot of tea." They settled on a wooden bench beneath a climbing rose. The kitchen window stood open, and the soft sound of a radio carried out, though the volume was low. The scent of elderflower and soap drifted in the air. "I keep replaying it," Charlotte said suddenly, cradling her teacup. "Over and over. That moment when Mrs. Langford didn't move. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't want to be the one to say it aloud." Miss Marple nodded. "It is often hardest to speak what others fear, especially when it makes something real." Charlotte swallowed, her gaze distant. "She's been awful to me lately, picking at everything I did, saying I wasn't pulling my weight with the fate. But I was. I planned the raffle, arranged the floral arch. I even embroidered the prize ribbons myself." "Indeed," Miss Marple said gently, "and quite beautifully, if I may say." Charlotte flushed. "Thank you. I only mention it because people seem to think I had something to gain. That because I was upset with her. I must have had a reason. People do love a tidy motive," Miss Marple said. "But life is rarely so simple." Charlotte bit her lip. "The truth is, I was afraid of her. Not in the way you fear a criminal, but in the way a servant fears dismissal. She held everything over me. My place here, my allowance, even the clothes I wear. She could make you feel like you didn't deserve the air you breathed." Miss Marple said nothing, letting the silence hold. Charlotte stared down at her teacup. "The day before the fete, she told me she'd written to her solicitor, that she was changing something. She didn't say what, but she looked at me with that smug little smile she had, like she was already enjoying my surprise." "Did she mention who the letter was for?" Miss Marple asked. Charlotte shook her head. "No. But I hoped maybe she was making peace. There was someone she fell out with years ago, a brother or cousin, I think. They used to write to each other. Then it all stopped." Miss Marple made a mental note, "and this sewing cushion," she said casually. "Did you bring it yourself?" Charlotte's eyes widened. "No, it was already there when I arrived. It was part of the display Mrs. Tilling brought, I think. Or perhaps it was one of the ones the Women's Guild had submitted. Did Mrs. Langford choose that chair herself?" "She did. Asked for a better one. That's when I brought it out of the back. It looked nice with the cushion, so I just set it all up together." "I see," Miss Marple said softly. They sat in silence for a time, the birds singing and the leaves fluttering gently overhead. Then Charlotte asked, in a very small voice, "Do you think someone hated her enough to Do it." Miss Marple took a sip of her tea, then met the girl's gaze. "My dear," she said, "I've often thought that hatred is a quieter thing than people expect. It does not always shout or strike. Sometimes it merely waits, and chooses the moment when no one is looking." That afternoon, Miss Marple returned home and opened the bureau in her sitting room. From the drawer, she withdrew a faded notebook, a relic of another case long since solved. But she always found it useful to remind herself of patterns. She flipped to a page marked in pencil premeditation 1, opportunity created, not stumbled upon 2. Object used was familiar or symbolic 3. Motive rests on humiliation, not rage. She drew a fresh line beneath and began to write. The cushion was not random, chosen, or bait. Langford expected dominance, not danger. Charlotte motive of fear, not gain. Mrs. Tilling recent dispute, embroidery display involved. Change in will equals potential flashpoint. Who benefits? She paused, tapping her pencil against her chin. The killer, she suspected, had wanted the scene to feel mundane, a death mistaken for faintness, a crime buried in domestic normalcy. But Miss Marple had long understood that it was precisely in such settings that the darkest intentions could thrive. Unnoticed, the cushion, the seat, the cup of tea, it was not the loud moments of the fate that held the answer, it was the quiet ones. And the village, in its chatter and worry, was already beginning to forget how silence had stolen in between the brass music and the jam scones and left behind a corpse. Miss Marple folded her notes and returned them to the drawer. There would be more questions to ask, more shadows to gently shine a light upon. But the threads were beginning to show their ends, and she, above all, knew how to follow them. Tuesday arrived with a crisp breeze and low, silvered clouds drifting across the rooftops of Nether Durnham. The postman, Mr. Clegg, made his rounds with a slower gait than usual, pausing longer at each door, no doubt in hopes of catching wind of the latest developments in the case. But gossip had begun to settle into caution, the way it often did when speculation turned inward and people started wondering how much they themselves had said and to whom. Miss Marple spent the early part of the morning in her garden deadheading roses and observing the passage of neighbours along the lane. It was not surveillance, not exactly. But there were things one could glean from the way a man closed his gate or the way a woman lingered at her doorstep long after the milk had been collected. At 10:30, a knock came at her door. It was Mrs. Bletchley, a matronly woman with a bosom like a sideboard and a hat trimmed with artificial cherries. She was, among many things, the president of the Nether Durham Women's Guild and the unofficial keeper of social records. "I do hope I'm not disturbing," she said. Already inside the sitting room before Miss Marple could answer, "I thought perhaps you might want to see these." From her large handbag, she produced a stack of fabric swatches and decorative cushions, one of which was the twin of the velvet cushion used in the sewing tent display. "We're doing an inventory for the guild, for the exhibits, in light of, well, recent events. We thought it prudent, and I thought since you have such a careful eye, Miss Marple, you might help me verify which pieces were officially submitted and which were brought in on the day." Miss Marple smiled as she took the items gently into her lap. "Very sensible, my dear. It wouldn't make things go missing in the confusion." The cushion was lovely. Deep burgundy velvet, the fabric worn smooth from years of use. At its centre bloomed a stitched English rose, delicate in its petal shading. But what struck Miss Marple most was not the embroidery. It was the small tear near the corner seemed neatly mended, yes, but hastily so, and just beside it, a single stitch of mismatched thread. "Were these both brought in by the same person?" she asked. Mrs. Bletchley pursed her lips. The original set, yes, from Mrs. Tilling. She said they belonged to her aunt, and that she'd restored them herself. Miss Marple Nodded. Do you recall if the one Mrs. Langford used was part of the set she displayed inside the tent, or was it added after? Mrs. Bletchley thought for a moment, adjusting her cherries. I believe it was meant for the side table. Decorative, you know, but someone placed it on the chair at the last moment. I assumed Charlotte had moved it. How curious, Miss Marple murmured. Once Mrs. Bletchley had taken her leave with a sherry promised for next Thursday, Miss Marple returned to her notes. She laid the cushion carefully on the writing desk and ran her fingers gently over the fabric. Then, with a small pair of embroidery scissors, she unpicked the corner seam. She found nothing inside, but she hadn't expected to. What interested her was the structure and the way the cushion had been restuffed. Beneath the velvet and wadding was an inner lining far more rigid than was typical, a flat board lined with cotton. It would have offered just enough resistance to hold a shape too firm for comfort, but ideal for something else. Miss Marple reached into her bureau drawer and retrieved a small brooch pin, one of her own. She pressed it gently against the cushion and observed how easily it would protrude through the surface if someone had aligned it with care. She replaced the pin and closed the drawer. The conclusion was uncomfortable, yet undeniable. The cushion had been used deliberately, not merely as decoration, not as an afterthought. Someone had meant for Mrs. Langford to sit upon it, and when she did, she had been pricked most likely by a needle or pin laced with something far more dangerous than thread. The next step was to confirm the existence of such a substance. And for that, Miss Marple needed someone who dealt not in whispers or embroidery, but in ingredients. She made her way to Finch's pharmacy after luncheon. The bell above the door jingled, and a waft of menthol and lavender greeted her. Mr. Finch looked up from behind the counter, where he was decanting powder into brown paper sachets. Miss Marple, always a pleasure. Now what can I do for you? Something for your joints, perhaps, or a tincture? Neither, thank you, Mr. Finch. I'm here on a different sort of matter. She lowered her voice. I was wondering, purely out of curiosity, whether a substance exists that might be absorbed into the bloodstream through the skin, something that could be applied to the point of a needle, say, and have an immediate effect. Finch blinked, then adjusted his spectacles. Well, that's not a question one hears every day. He leaned closer. There are a few compounds, yes, the more exotic alkaloids, extract of monkshood, for instance aconitine, rare and quite dangerous. Even a small amount could induce cardiac arrest. It is absorbed quickly through tissue. There are others, of course, belladonna, datura, but they usually need ingestion. And aconitine, Miss Marple asked, is it easy to acquire? He gave her a look. Certainly not in a legal sense. Though monkshood grows wild in some cottage gardens, it's a handsome plant, blue-purple flowers. People rarely know what it is. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Thank you, Mr. Finch. You've been most helpful. As she walked home, her thoughts gathered. Like storm clouds, the method, she now believed, was clear. What remained was motive and access. She paused at the corner, where the lane curved toward the village hall. Across the green, Mrs. Tilling was speaking with Inspector Grayson, her hands fluttering as if shooing away suspicion. Nearby, Lady Beckwith emerged from the grocer's, her face pinched with annoyance. Miss Marple's gaze lingered on Lady Beckwith a moment longer. Dorothea Langford had been formidable, yes, but she had also been a woman of status, and in a village such as this, status was rarely shared easily. There were always rivalries beneath the surface. Lady Beckwith had made herself the grand hostess of the fete, but Miss Langford had once held that role. Has there been a shift, a private quarrel, or had someone else, someone less visible, seen an opportunity to settle a different kind of score? Miss Marple stood still, the cool breeze tugging at the edge of her scarf. The question was no longer whether Mrs. Langford had been murdered. It was who had planned such a quiet calculated death hidden beneath the velvet comfort of a cushion, and the pleasant chaos of a village fete. The answer, she felt, was beginning to take shape, but the pattern was not yet complete. By Wednesday morning, the wind had changed in Nether Durnham. It came in brisk from the west, rattling the churchyard yews and lifting skirts along the high street. With it came a sense of unease not spoken aloud, not yet, but settling into conversations. Like a draught slipping under a door, people kept their greetings briefer, their glances lingered longer. Inspector Grayson was now staying at the Rose and Thistle Inn, a sure sign that the investigation had outgrown its early assumptions. He had taken to walking the village in the afternoons, occasionally accompanied by young Constable Brewer, though more often than not, he was seen speaking alone to shopkeepers and widows, noting things down, folding and refolding his notebook. Like a man with too many pieces and not enough puzzle, Miss Marple, meanwhile, had written a letter. It was addressed to the firm of Caldeckett and Swan, solicitors, in the neighbouring town of Ashcombe, and it was a very polite letter, framed as a friendly inquiry from a concerned resident regarding Mrs. Langford's most recent legal communications. It was not unusual for Miss Marple to correspond with solicitors indeed. She had long held a reputation for impeccable estate knowledge, having settled more than one complicated will in her circle of acquaintances. But in this case, her interest had a specific thread to follow. 3 days before her death, Dorothea Langford had visited Ashcombe. She had not taken the regular bus. Instead, she accepted a ride from Lady Beckwith's chauffeur, a detail Miss Marple had confirmed during a brief conversation outside the bakery. She asked Wilkins to drop her off near the market. Lady Beckwith had said with a sniff, "Didn't say why. Though of course I suspected it was something to do with that wretched family trust of hers, always so secretive about her affairs," but Miss Marple suspected otherwise. She believed Dorothea had gone to amend her will, and someone, perhaps more than one person, had found out. The letter she posted was short, tactful, and phrased in a tone that suggested concern for the legal firm's discretion more than curiosity. She didn't expect a reply by return post, but she hoped the mere act of sending it would stir a reaction. In her experience, information often came not from direct answers, but from what was not said, or who began to grow nervous once the right questions were asked. By midday, her hunch was rewarded. She was in the greengrocer's, selecting pears, when she overheard a terse exchange near the till. Absolutely no business of hers, hissed a voice, unmistakably that of Lady Beckwith. "She'll find out anyway," came the reply, equally sharp. "You know what she's like." Miss Marple, careful not to turn her head, shifted her basket closer to the rhubarb and waited. "She's sniffing around already," Lady Beckwith continued, talking to everyone, digging into Dorothea's affairs. "And now the solicitors have been written to. If that codicil is found, the bell above the door rang as the pair swept out." Miss Marple remained where she stood for a moment, her fingers still poised over a bruised apple. Codicil, a word with weight. A codicil was a change to a will, sometimes small, sometimes substantial, and if it were recent, and not yet formally registered, back at home, Miss Marple opened her notebook again. She listed names in a neat hand: Charlotte Beckwith, dependent on Mrs. Langford, treated poorly. Motive: fear, desperation. Lady Beckwith is a rival for village influence. Had knowledge of Dorothea's visit to Ashcombe. Motive: inheritance. Status: Mrs. Tilling, newcomer. Dispute over sewing display. Provided. Cushion: motive: personal insult. Secret grudge. Unnamed relative. Hinted by Charlotte. Estranged. Possibly reinstated in new codicil. Motive: hidden. She paused. Then, beneath those names, she wrote the cushion was planted, but who placed it on that chair? And who knew Mrs. Langford would ask for that specific? seat. Later that afternoon, Inspector Grayson arrived at Miss Marple's gate. He was red-faced from walking and looked as if he had not slept well. Miss Marple offered him a cup of tea and a butter biscuit, which he accepted with the reluctant gratitude of a man cornered into courtesy. "I won't take much of your time, Miss Marple," he began. "But I'd be a fool not to acknowledge that you tend to see things differently. I do try," she said mildly. "The advantage, I find, of living long enough to see how people behave when they think no one notices." The inspector took a sip of tea, then leaned back. "We've confirmed something today." The toxicology report came in. There was aconitine in her system, a minute amount, but concentrated, likely absorbed through a puncture wound. Miss Marple nodded. "So it wasn't tea?" "No, nor anything she ate." "No sign of ingestion." "The cushion," Miss Marple said softly. He raised his eyebrows. "That's your theory, too." "I don't often have theories, Inspector, but I do have a fondness for patterns. And this one is unusually embroidered." He smiled, despite himself. "We also learned that Mrs. Langford did, in fact, visit her solicitor. A codicil was drawn up, one that made significant changes to her will. It hasn't been registered formally, but a copy was retained. The key change was the reinstatement of a former beneficiary." "Do you have a name?" Grayson consulted his notebook. "A man named Graham Langford, her nephew, apparently disowned after some business involving missing funds, but she made peace with him recently. The codicil reinstated his claim and reduced others." "Which others?" "Charlotte's stipend was halved, and Lady Beckwith's charitable trust, set to receive a considerable amount, was removed entirely." Miss Marple stirred her tea. "And how many people knew of this before her death?" "Hard to say. But someone guessed, and now that codicil may be all that remains of her true intentions." Miss Marple looked out the window toward the lane. "Then I suspect the motive was not just resentment," she said quietly, "but prevention." Inspector Grayson stood, dusting biscuit crumbs from his coat. "Well, if you learn anything more, I'll be in touch," Miss Marple promised. That night, sleep came slowly. Outside, the wind had quieted, but Miss Marple's thoughts churned in the hush. Someone had known about the codicil, someone who stood to lose, whether in wealth, standing, or control. They had acted quickly, using means both clever and cruel, but they had made one mistake. They had chosen a method that required precision, placement, planning, and those things could be traced. Soon, Miss Marple thought she would ask the question that mattered most. Not who had the most to gain, but who had moved the cushion, because in that single, silent action lay the truth. Thursday arrived with a veil of mist resting low across Nether Durnham, casting a pale hush over the village rooftops and hedgerows. The stillness felt unnatural, almost rehearsed, like the breath held in before a final line in a play. Even the birds seemed reluctant to sing that morning. Miss Marple had risen early, her teacup warming her palms as she stood by the window of her front sitting room, gazing thoughtfully out at the lane. Though the sun would burn through the fog soon enough, the village was already beginning to stir, shadows moving behind curtains. A figure slipping past with a coat pulled tight, the distant clatter of milk bottles being set on doorsteps. A decision had settled in her mind. It was time to return to the sewing tent. The fete grounds had long been cleared, the striped marquees dismantled and folded away. But the sewing tent itself remained standing at the edge of the rectory lawn, sealed with police tape and largely ignored by the villagers now too wary to approach. Miss Marple, however, had quietly arranged for the rector's key. Reverend Hakem had handed it over with a nervous glance and a mumbled, "Of course, if you think it might help, Miss Marple. Though I must say, I never imagined murder nearer." Tea urns and hymn books. At precisely 9:15, she stepped through the dewy grass, opened the canvas flap, and entered the space where Dorothea Langford had met her end. The air was heavy with disuse, faintly musty with the scent of fabric, dust, and something darker lingering beneath. The table where the embroidered displays had once been arranged now stood bare, and the folding chairs were scattered as if hastily. Moved in the aftermath of confusion, Miss Marple moved slowly, retracing what she knew. There had been tea, embroidery demonstrations, and scones. Mrs. Langford had arrived mid-afternoon, taken her seat, made several cutting remarks, and then died. But where did that chair come from? She looked around. There were 5 identical folding chairs leaning against the tent wall, and yet she remembered Charlotte saying that she had brought a different one for Mrs. Langford, a better one, she'd said. Miss Marple spotted it quickly. It was taller, with a spindle back and slightly more ornate legs, the kind one might find in a sitting room rather than at a village fete. It looked out of place among the utilitarian fold-ups. She examined the seat. There was no cushion on it now, but the way it was angled just slightly away from the table, turned more toward the corner, suggested it had been positioned for a reason. Or by someone who understood what would follow. Miss Marple folded her hands and stood in the center of the tent, her eyes drifting shut for a moment. She envisioned it all again. Charlotte arrived early, setting up the display. Mrs. Tilling brought in her embroidery samples, the table being arranged, the bustle of the crowd outside, and then Mrs. Langford entered. Insisting on a more comfortable seat, Charlotte obliged. The cushion, where was it placed before? On the side table, Mrs. Bletchley had said, moved, perhaps thoughtlessly, or perhaps not. Miss Marple opened her eyes. The person who had moved the cushion knew Mrs. Langford would demand a more comfortable chair. They knew Charlotte would fetch one. That part could be relied upon. What couldn't be left to chance was the final placement. Someone had to place the cushion on the chair, knowing Mrs. Langford would sit there. She returned home by midday, her boots damp from the grass, her expression thoughtful. A few doors down, she saw Lady Beckwith speaking to the postman with rather forced cheer. Charlotte was nowhere in sight. Inside, Miss Marple prepared herself a light lunch, then sat down once more with her notes. She drew a small diagram of the tent's layout, table, chairs, entrance, and display. Then she marked an X where the special chair had stood. She paused. There had been a brief moment, Charlotte had said, when Mrs. Tilling had gone to retrieve something. She had left the tent. At the time, Miss Marple had thought little of it. But now she considered the timing more carefully. Charlotte had gone to fetch the chair. Mrs. Tilling had gone to fetch a needle roll. Who had remained behind? Only Mrs. Langford and the cushion. Miss Marple rose and crossed to her bookshelf. From between 2 gardening guides, she withdrew an old ledger, one she used not for finances, but for observations. She found a blank page and began a list. Opportunity to plant the cushion on the chair Charlotte is unlikely to find. She fetched the chair, but returned to a chair already cushioned. Her shock had seemed genuine. Mrs. Tilling left the tent during setup, but returned before Charlotte did. Lady Beckwith is not inside the tent, but nearby, might have influenced placement. Indirectly, but not directly. Others, unlikely, witnesses around. Miss Marple wrote another line. Who benefits most if the codicil is not enforced? The answer was stark: Lady Beckwith, not just because she was removed from the will, but because she had been embarrassed by Dorothea Langford in recent months, usurped in committee roles outshined in local charity circles, and Lady Beckwith, though always composed in public, did not take humiliation lightly. And then there was the matter of the chauffeur. If Mrs. Langford had requested to be dropped near the market, but had ended up at the solicitor's office, someone could have been watching. Miss Marple fetched her knitting from the basket by the hearth. Her fingers moved almost absent-mindedly across the needles, but her thoughts remained sharp. If the codicil were to be discovered, Lady Beckwith's trust would receive nothing. If Mrs. Langford had lived long enough to register it formally. It would have been irreversible. But now it was in limbo, unregistered, contested, buried beneath suspicion, unless it could be proven that her death had been planned, and that the cushion, laced with aconitine, had been planted deliberately. As the clock struck 4, Miss Marple stood, set her knitting down, and tied on her coat. It was time to speak again with Charlotte. She found her in the garden behind the manor, deadheading begonias with a pair of shears far too large for the task. Charlotte looked up as Miss Marple approached, her face pale and drawn. "Miss Marple," she said, "is there news?" "Not yet," Miss Marple replied, "but I wanted to ask something very simple." Charlotte nodded, nervously. "That day at the fete, when you fetched the chair, did you place the cushion yourself?" Charlotte blinked. "No," she said slowly. "It was already there, on the seat. I remember thinking it looked out of place, but Mrs. Langford was in a hurry to sit down, and I didn't want to make a fuss. Who was in the tent when you returned?" Charlotte hesitated. "Just Mrs. Langford and Mrs. Tilling." But Mrs. Tilling was standing at the side table, arranging her threads. "She barely noticed me come back in." "I see," Miss Marple said. She thanked Charlotte and took her leave. That night, she wrote one more note in her ledger. The chair was bait, the cushion, the trap. But the killer stood beside them and watched it all unfold. Calm, silent, waiting for the prick. She underlined the next line. A needle placed by hand, but whose hand knew precisely where to press? The answer, she was certain now, would soon reveal itself, but it would take one more step, one final thread to bring it all to light. Friday dawned with a soft golden haze over Nether Durnham, casting a deceptive warmth over the hedgerows and cottage walls. The village, though calm in appearance, was bristling beneath its surface. Conversations behind lace curtains grew shorter, glances between neighbours more pointed. Something had shifted. The sense of idle curiosity had given way to quiet vigilance. People were waiting now, not speculating. Miss Marple, as usual, kept to her routine. She made her tea, sorted the post, an advertisement for jam jars and a note from her niece, and watered her hydrangeas with practiced care. But her thoughts were not on blossoms or correspondence. Her mind was circling, narrowing in on a conclusion that had grown firmer with each visit, each seemingly innocent remark. She was not quite ready for a formal accusation. No, that would be premature. But she had reached the point where one must gently test the threads, pull ever so slightly, and see which one snapped. That required a conversation, a specific one. By mid-morning, she made her way to the corner of Chestnut Row, where Mrs. Tilling's small, well-kept cottage sat behind a wrought-iron gate, nearly hidden by sweet peas in bloom. The house was quiet, the windows open to the breeze. Miss Marple rang the bell, then waited. It was a moment before the door opened. "Miss Marple," said Mrs. Tilling, her eyes wary but polite. "Do come in. I was just finishing some mending." Inside, the sitting room smelled of lavender water and clean cotton. A half-mended shirt lay across the arm of a chair, and a silver thimble sat near a pincushion shaped like a tomato. Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the sewing table, tidy, precise, every spool aligned. "I won't keep you long," she said, accepting a seat. "I've been reflecting on that dreadful afternoon at the fete, and it occurred to me how strange it must have felt to have one's work involved in such an unhappy business." Mrs. Tilling folded her hands. "You mean the cushion?" "Yes, a very fine piece of work, though I did notice it had been mended in one corner." The younger woman's eyes flicked away. "It was originally my aunt's. I did my best to restore it." "I'm sure you did. Velvet can be quite deceptive, you know, soft to the eye, but dense enough to conceal a great deal beneath the surface." There was a pause, not long, but enough for Miss Marple to note the tightening in Mrs. Tilling's jaw. I imagine it must have been distressing, she continued, to have Mrs. Langford speak so sharply about the embroidery, especially considering the effort that went into displaying it. Mrs. Tilling gave a brittle smile. She never liked my work, or me, really. She was difficult with many people, Miss Marple replied. But not all of them are dead. That makes your position rather uncomfortable. The words were spoken gently, without menace, but Mrs. Tilling's fingers clutched her skirt tightly. I didn't put the cushion on that chair, she said. I brought it for the display. I placed it on the side table, not the seat. Miss Marple nodded. Yes, Charlotte said as much. But she also said that when she returned with the more comfortable chair, the cushion was already placed, and you, Mrs. Tilling, were the only one in the tent at the time. There was silence now. Not heavy, but dense like the stillness before her. Dropped teacup shatters on tile. I didn't know it would kill her, Mrs. Tilling said at last, her voice thin. Not certainly. I only wanted her to feel a jab, a warning, a discomfort to match the humiliation she's caused me since the day I arrived. Miss Marple said nothing. She let the confession hang in the air like the scent of old perfume. I had found a passage in one of my aunt's old herbal books. Mrs. Tilling went on, eyes glassy now, about aconite. Just a pinch of the root, they said, enough to cause a tremor, a faintness, but I never imagined it would. She broke off, pressing her fingers to her mouth. It was never meant to be murder. Miss Marple sat very still. That, she said softly, is often how it begins. A small intention, an adjustment, and then the moment tips, and there is no going back. Mrs. Tilling shook her head slowly. It was meant to be poetic, in a way. She mocked my stitching, my chair, my presence. I thought it was just a little pain. Just enough to remind her that I wasn't invisible. She didn't notice, Miss Marple said. Mrs. Tilling blinked. She didn't cry out, didn't even wince. Which leads me to wonder if the dose was truly small, or had it already been tested. The colour drained from the woman's face. Miss Marple continued, you see, I visited the tent, examined the cushion. The stitching in the corner was not merely repaired. It was realigned to accommodate something rigid, something sharp, Mrs. Tilling said. Nothing, there was no accident, no improvisation. It was planned, measured, you even adjusted the height of the wadding. That's not done on a whim, dear. Mrs. Tilling's voice came as a whisper now. She humiliated me in front of the guild. Said my patterns were derivative, said I should be grateful. Just to observe, not exhibit. She called me a fraud. I thought if she just felt a pinch, it would be enough. Miss Marple leaned forward, her eyes kind but resolute. She died, Mrs. Tilling, quietly, yes, but irrevocably. There is no gentleness in that. There was a long silence. Finally, Mrs. Tilling stood, her hands trembling. Do you intend to tell the inspector? I do, Miss Marple said gently. But I shall tell him the whole of it, including your confession, including your intent. The court may not spare you, but the truth will. Mrs. Tilling turned away, her breath shuddering in her throat. Miss Marple rose, touching the woman's shoulder briefly. In the end, dear, even a needle leaves a trail. She departed quietly, closing the gate behind her as the mist began to lift fully from the village. The sun had broken through, gilding the thatched rooftops in light. Birds sang now, cautious at first, then in full chorus. By the time she reached her own garden gate, Miss Marple knew the work was nearly done. The pattern was complete, but before she could rest, there remained one final stitch. The village needed to understand not just what had been done, but why. It had been allowed to happen in plain sight, and for that, Miss Marple would prepare a little tea and a very pointed invitation by Saturday afternoon. The fog that had cloaked Nether Durnham all week had finally cleared. The air was warm, still, and bright with a soft sunlight that fell gently on window panes and flower beds. But beneath that golden quiet, something in the village felt lighter, yes, but also fragile. Like a room after the furniture has been rearranged. Familiar yet subtly unsettled, Miss Marple had spent the morning arranging her sitting room with quiet precision. The small table beside the window had been polished, a tray of teacups and lemon biscuits set upon it with their matching saucers. She had selected her blue floral teapot, the one reserved for more serious occasions, and laid out a starched napkin. Beneath the milk jug, her cat, Tuppence, had been ushered out to the garden to avoid weaving through guests' legs. By 2 o'clock, the 3 women arrived, one after the other. Lady Beckwith was first, dressed impeccably in a rose-coloured jacket and hat, her expression strained but fixed into a semblance of graciousness. "I do hope I'm not the first," she said, stepping into the cottage with the air of someone entering a battlefield disguised as a parlour. "You're just in time," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "Please sit by the window. You'll catch the best light." Next came Charlotte Beckwith, face pale, hair pinned back with care. She carried the look of someone who had not yet recovered from recent days' shadows under the eyes, lips that pressed too tightly together when not speaking. But she gave a polite smile, and her eyes searched Miss Marple's for reassurance. Then, last, came Inspector Grayson. He was not in uniform, but wore a dark brown suit that gave him the appearance of a solicitor rather than a police officer. He nodded at Miss Marple and took a chair near the fireplace, his notebook tucked into his inner jacket pocket. Miss Marple waited until everyone had their tea before she spoke. "I'm very grateful you were all able to come," she began. "I asked you here not to point fingers, but to bring clarity to the events of last Saturday and to the nature of what truly occurred." Lady Beckwith set down her cup with a delicate clink. "I can't imagine what good it will do now, Jane. The dreadful business is over, isn't it? The inspector has all he needs." Grayson gave her a neutral look but said nothing. Miss Marple folded her hands. Indeed, the most pressing question, who administered the fatal blow, as it were, has been answered. But the act itself was not isolated. It was enabled, as such things often are, by silence, by knowledge withheld, by the careful orchestration of moments that no one thought to question. She turned to Charlotte. "Tell me again, my dear, about the chair." Charlotte blinked. "The one I fetched for Mrs. Langford." "Yes, you fetched it after she complained about the folding chair." "I did, from the rectory storeroom. I brought it in, and the cushion was already on the seat when I returned." Miss Marple nodded. "And where was everyone else when you returned?" Charlotte's gaze dropped. Mrs. Langford had already taken her place. Mrs. Tilling was standing to one side, arranging her display. "Indeed," said Miss Marple, "but what if I told you the placement of that chair and that cushion wasn't happening?" Lady Beckwith let out a breath. "Really, Jane, is this necessary?" Miss Marple turned to her. "I believe it is, Evelyn, because you see, you knew Mrs. Langford intended to change her will. You knew she had visited her solicitor in Ashcombe, and you knew what that codicil would do to your standing, both financial and social." Lady Beckwith stiffened. "I did no such thing." "You did. Wilkins, your chauffeur, mentioned you had dropped her off in Ashcombe yourself, and you knew it wasn't the market she was visiting. You had her followed, or more likely, you simply asked Wilkins where he left her. You deduced the truth and realized you were being cut out." Lady Beckwith said nothing, but a faint flush rose on her cheeks. "I don't accuse you of murder," Miss Marple continued gently, "but I do suggest that your knowledge prompted you to do something else, something seemingly innocuous. On the day of the fete, you instructed Charlotte to bring a more comfortable chair for Mrs. Langford if she complained, did you not?" Charlotte looked up, startled. "Yes," she said slowly. "You did mention that." Lady Beckwith, you said Aunt Dorothea would throw a fit if made to sit on a folding chair. Lady Beckwith's mouth pressed into a thin line. I was trying to avoid a scene, perhaps, Miss Marple said. But by planting that thought, by guiding the moment, you ensured that Dorothea would end up in that particular chair, and that the person who fetched it would not question a cushion already in place. Charlotte turned pale. Are you saying I know, my dear? Miss Marple said quickly. You did nothing wrong. But someone else used the moment. Someone else placed that cushion there. She turned to Inspector Grayson. I visited Mrs. Tilling yesterday, she confessed in her own way. Not to deliberate murder, but to intend harm, a calculated jab, an idea she'd cultivated in quiet for some time. She poisoned the needle, inserted it through the cushion's surface, positioned the whole thing so carefully, but even she could not predict that Mrs. Langford's heart would stop so quickly. Grayson nodded slowly. We've taken her into custody, he said. She turned herself in this morning after you left. Well, verify everything. Lady Beckwith gave a thin, high laugh. So we're to believe she did all this herself? Over an embroidery grudge? No, Miss Marple said softly. Not just that, but years of being dismissed, marginalist, treated as ornamental. Women have been driven to far worse with less provocation. She stood and walked to the window, looking out toward the green. And you, Evelyn, did not drive in the final pin, but you laid the cushion, you turned the chair, and you said nothing after because deep down I believe you were relieved. Lady Beckwith rose abruptly. That's quite enough, yes, Miss Marple said, still looking out. It is. Lady Beckwith left in silence, the door clicking shut behind her. Charlotte sat motionless, eyes wide, and the inspector looked down at his notebook. Though he did not open it, Miss Marple turned at last and offered the girl a kind smile. You are free of it now. Charlotte, truly, your aunt's codicil will be honoured. Inspector Grayson will see to that. And you will no longer be under her thumb. Charlotte nodded slowly, the tension in her shoulders beginning to ease. Outside, the bells of St. Martin's rang for an hour. And in the stillness that followed, Miss Marple quietly poured another cup of tea. She did not gloat, she did not sign. She simply stirred in a splash of milk, lifted the cup to her lips, and sipped, watching the world carry on, as it always did, just slightly altered by the truth that had come to light. Sunday in Nether Durnham dawned with a peace so complete, it was almost uncanny. The village green lay quiet, its grass cropped and sun warmed, the shadows of bunting poles now absent and fading from memory. At the far end, the church bells of St. Martin's pealed out for morning service, their tone softer than usual, as if the village itself were still adjusting to the silence left in the wake of recent revelations. At the centre of this stillness sat Miss Marple, at her table by the window, sewing a loose hem on a linen tea towel with slow, precise stitches. Her cat, Tuppence, dozed beside her in a patch of sunlight, one paw twitching in sleep. Outside, the world resumed its rhythm. A bicycle bell rang, a child called out, and the baker opened his shutters with a clatter. The murder of Dorothea Langford was no longer the only subject of whispered conversation. It had become, slowly and gently, a part of the village's fabric, discussed with regret, remembered with unease, and eventually filed away beside other local misfortunes, like the flood of '37 or the scandal of the church roof fund. Life, as it does, has begun to press forward, but Miss Marple had not forgotten. Later that morning, she took a stroll through the lane that led to the rectory. The grass still bore faint traces of where the tents had stood, and near the rose border, a single knitting needle glinted faintly in the earth, half buried and overlooked. She picked it up, examined it, and tucked it into her pocket with the air of someone tidying up the last thread of a story nearly finished. The rector met her by the light gate. Miss Marple, he said warmly, I hear congratulations are in order. Inspector Grayson said your insights were rather instrumental. I do try, Reverend, she replied, though I think it's less insight and more observation. People do say the most interesting things when they believe no one is listening, he chuckled. Softly, a lesson in humility for us all. They parted with kind words, and Miss Marple continued down the lane. Pausing once at the gate of Beckwith Manor, Charlotte stood in the garden, trimming back a row of foxgloves. She looked up as Miss Marple approached, and this time her smile was brighter, tentative still, but real. I was just about to come by, Charlotte said. To thank you. Miss Marple shook her head gently. No thanks needed, my dear. Truth always has its way of wriggling free like a thread caught in the lining. They walked together for a moment through the edge of the garden. Bees hummed near the lavender, and a blackbird fluttered across the stone wall. The manor, once stiff with formality, seemed somehow softer now. I'm not sure what comes next, Charlotte admitted. I suppose the estate will be settled soon. There's still a solicitor from Ashcombe sorting out the paperwork, and Graham Langford is to visit next week. He's been kind in his letters. Not what Aunt Dorothea described at all. People do change, Miss Marple murmured, or perhaps they reveal themselves in gentler lights, when no longer under the shadows of bitterness. Charlotte looked down at the flowers she'd clipped. I'm afraid I let too much pass. I let her shape my world until I forgot I had one of my own. Miss Marple smiled. There is no shame in endurance, Charlotte, but there is strength in knowing when to stop enduring. Back at home, Miss Marple set the needle she'd found on her writing desk. Next to her worn notebook, the case was, by all accounts, closed. Mrs. Tilling had made a full statement to Inspector Grayson, who had, in turn, arranged for her transfer to a hospital in Bath for psychiatric evaluation pending formal charges. Given her confession and the lack of premeditation toward death, it was likely the court would treat her with a measure of mercy. Lady Beckwith, though not legally culpable, had quietly stepped down from all public committees. Her presence in the village had taken on a new tone, no longer regal, but cautious. The weight of public judgment, it seemed, could reach corners the law did not. Miss Marple poured herself a cup of tea and sat beside the open window. She thought of the fate, the laughter, the bustle, the music, and how it had all coexisted, for a time, with the presence of something silent and deadly. A velvet cushion, a poisoned needle, a plan so neat it had nearly passed unnoticed, and yet the truth had spoken in quiet ways, in the way a cushion was stitched, in the way a young woman's voice cracked under strain, in the way people carried their grievances like embroidery, layered, patterned, and always threaded with more than met the eye. The village would remember the crime, but it would not understand it in full. It would remain one of those stories with edges blurred by gossip and softened by time, a tale for late evenings over tea, or cautionary whispers to newcomers about old tempers and sewing needles. Miss Marple reached for her pen. She opened a fresh page in her ledger and wrote puzzle solved, method poisoned needle, concealed in cushion, motive personal humiliation, long-held resentment. Means carefully orchestrated placement, quiet, unnoticed, devastating. Others involved indirectly. Yes, influence without guilt, guilt without consequence. She paused. Then, in the smaller script beneath murder is rarely loud. It is the quiet hand, the still expression, the familiar face that startles most when turned the wrong way. There were knocks again at her door in the days that followed. Some to ask advice about begonias, some to inquire about embroidery patterns, and some simply to sit with tea and seek comfort in her calm presence. She welcomed them all, for Miss Marple understood better than most the peace of a village was not in its silence, but in how it healed after someone had finally spoken the truth. And as summer unfurled once more across Nether Durnham, the old rhythms resumed. but in the mind of one elderly lady, sharp-eyed and quietly relentless. The puzzle of the velvet sewing cushion would always remain not as a curiosity, but as a reminder that even in the gentlest of places, the sharpest threads may lie just beneath the surface.